Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, one of the biggest challenges, perhaps the greatest challenge in Civil War portrait photography, is identifying the individual when his name is lost in time. These images have so much to tell us if we look at them as evidence in a detective case and trying to figure out who they are, the photograph is really the best place to start. It's exhibit A, if you really want to look at it in terms of a detective, in terms of photo sleuthing. So in this case, we have a lot to work with. There's a story here to tell, and a bit of a spoiler alert, I don't yet have the identity of this soldier, but what I'm going to share with you now gives us my working theory as to who he might be and offers some new ways to search and try to find out who exactly he is. So, getting back to the idea that this is evidence in the case, let's take a look. What we have here is a card photograph, a carte de visite, which is now Buman print on a cardstock mount. It's about the size of a modern trading card. These images were really popular during the Civil War period. So that's a big clue right there. The style, the format of the photograph gives us at least a target date of when it might be made. Now, if we flip the image over, we're going to see that there's a back mark or a photographer's imprint. This is another bit of critical evidence. And here we can see the name Miller, the name of the photographer, and the photographer's location in Boston, Massachusetts. So, might we have a soldier who was from Boston, lived in the Boston area, was connected to the military in some way? It's also possible that he was from someplace else in New England and happened to be passing through Boston and sat for his photograph. So at least we have perhaps a general location of where this individual lived. And of course, we know now that he stepped into the photographer studio of Miller in Boston and had this image taken. So that's a good bit of knowledge right there. Now let's get back to the portrait itself and look at the content of the portrait. So we can see that he has a uniform on, he has a frock coat, and there is some interesting trim going on. The collar has a light fabric around it with a brass button. The cuffs are similarly decked out in a light colored cloth, and you can see what appears to be at least one brass button, and there's probably two more, and the edge of the cuff is probably fluted with the brass buttons. And also take a look at his shoulder. You can see a loop, a fabric loop, where an epaulette could be attached. So, one more item to notice is his pocket. There's a sort of a chest or a vest pocket which has a flap on it. Now, if you take all these things together, the collar and the cuffs and the pocket, it's not standard for a federal uniform of that time period, which leads me to think that what we're probably looking here at is a militia uniform. These these trimmed items, the collar and the cuff certainly are common enough to militia companies of that period. So I think it's fair to say that we're probably looking at a militia soldier. I'll also point out, although it's a little bit difficult to see here, his trousers appear to be civilian. They have very thin vertical stripes on them, which also suggests that maybe he didn't have his full uniform or he only wore his coat, his frock coat, for the photographer's pose. If we come a little bit closer into the image, you can take a look here and see the sling and the round plate that's attached to it. This sling holds a cartridge box, which is not visible, but we can see the plate. If you look closely and use your imagination, you'll be able to see the body of an eagle. This is a federal eagle belt plate. And you can see the leather, the dark leather, pretty rough looking, to which it is attached. Now, if we move down a little bit below the pocket area, we're going to see the cap box, which is attached to his waist belt plate, or the plate next to it. You can see the little oval plate. I'm guessing that oval plate could be a militia or a U.S. oval belt plate. The cap box clearly has a stamp on it, and you can see right in the middle of the flap are the initials U and S. So this is a US cap box attached to his weight belt. And of course, the biggest thing in the photograph, at least in this detail, is his hat. This is a non military hat, and it is very much a civilian hat. It's also pretty easy to see that he's got raindrops on that hat, which tells us he walked into the studio on a rainy day when he sat for this photograph. And there must not have been a lot of folks waiting because the hat didn't dry out. It still has the modeling from the drops on it. So if you put all these things together, the style of the photograph, the way that he is posed with his rainy hat, his civilian trousers, his uniform coat that appears to be militia, and his federal cartridge box and federal cap box, we can maybe think that those were issued to him from a U.S. arsenal that happens to be located in Boston or maybe somewhere else in New England. So, all of these things, you can put them together. And I would also mention that the photograph is probably of the early war period because of the style of it. It has no fancy border or ornamentation. It's just a flat cardstock mount. So putting all these things together, I think you can fairly say that this is probably an early war Massachusetts militiaman who was activated for federal service. He posed in a Boston photographer studio on a rainy day. Now, that may not seem like much, but it's more than what we started with. And we have the beginning now to do some additional searching. My first stop was to go to Civil War Photo Sleuth. You can check it out, civilwarphotosleuth.com, which uses face recognition to be able to identify soldier images. Unfortunately, I did not get a hit this time around. There were no matching images or similar images in the database that enabled me to make that identification. So my next stop, and what I'll do after this video is over, is begin poking around various Massachusetts archives and collections of images to see if I can identify this unit through the uniform and maybe, just maybe, be able to find out who he is. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.